Marcus Sullivan stood in the doorway of their cramped apartment, his single suitcase already waiting by the door. Elena looked up from the couch where she'd been resting, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. She'd been waiting for the right moment to tell him about the pregnancy, but that moment never seemed to come. Now, seeing the coldness in his eyes, she knew she'd waited too long. "I can't do this anymore, Elena," Marcus said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I married you thinking we'd build something together, but look at us. We're barely scraping by. I got a job offer in Seattle, and I'm taking it. Alone." The words hit Elena like physical blows. They'd been married for 3 years, struggling through his failed business ventures and mounting debt, but she'd never imagined he would simply walk away. Elena's voice trembled as she tried to speak. "Marcus, please. We can work through this. I have something important to tell you." But he cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "There's nothing you can say that will change my mind. I've already signed the lease on a new place. My lawyer will send you the divorce papers." He picked up his suitcase and, without a backward glance, walked out of their apartment and out of her life. Elena sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours. The shabby apartment suddenly felt cavernous and empty. She looked around at the water-stained ceiling, the second-hand furniture, the bare walls they'd never had money to decorate. Marcus had always resented their poverty, had blamed her for not contributing enough, even though she worked 2 jobs while he chased one failing dream after another. Now he was gone, and she was alone with a secret that would change everything. That night, Elena lay in bed unable to sleep, her hand resting on her stomach where 3 tiny lives were growing, though she didn't know it yet. She'd only discovered the pregnancy 2 weeks ago and had been waiting for Marcus's birthday next month to surprise him. She'd imagined his face lighting up with joy, imagined how a baby might give him purpose and motivation. Instead, she was facing single motherhood with barely enough money to feed herself, let alone a child. 3 weeks after Marcus left, Elena dragged herself to her first prenatal appointment at the free clinic downtown. She'd been experiencing severe morning sickness and exhaustion that went beyond what she remembered her sister going through. The clinic was crowded and understaffed, but the nurse practitioner who finally saw her was kind and thorough. "Let's take a look," the nurse said gently, applying cold gel to Elena's abdomen for the ultrasound. Elena stared at the ceiling, trying not to think about how Marcus should have been here holding her hand. The nurse moved the wand across her stomach, then paused, her eyes widening slightly. "Well," she said with a growing smile, "this explains why you've been feeling so rough." She turned the monitor toward Elena. "Congratulations, honey. You're having triplets." Elena's world tilted on its axis. That's not possible," she whispered, staring at the screen where 3 tiny forms were visible, their heartbeats flickering like small miracles. "Triplets." The nurse nodded, pointing out each baby. "See here, here, and here? 3 distinct sacs, 3 healthy heartbeats. You're about 9 weeks along, which makes you due in early June. Do you have family support? Carrying and caring for triplets is going to require a lot of help." Family support. Elena almost laughed. Her mother had died when she was 16, and her father had remarried and moved to Florida, barely maintaining contact. Her sister lived in Boston with her own young family and was struggling financially. And Marcus, the man who should have been her partner in this, had abandoned her for what he thought was a better life. She was utterly, completely alone with 3 babies on the way. The nurse must have seen something in Elena's face because her expression softened with concern. "Are you okay, sweetheart? Is there someone I can call?" Elena shook her head, swallowing hard against the tears threatening to overwhelm her. "No," she managed. "I'm alone. My husband left 3 weeks ago. He doesn't even know I'm pregnant, and I don't know how I'm going to do this." The nurse squeezed her hand. "One day at a time," she said firmly. "And you're not as alone as you think. Let me give you information about support programs for mothers of multiples." Elena returned to her empty apartment with a folder full of information about WIC programs, food stamps, and housing assistance. She felt overwhelmed and terrified, but also, surprisingly, determined. These babies hadn't asked to be born into poverty and abandonment. They deserved better, and somehow, she would give it to them. She was reading through pamphlets about prenatal nutrition when a knock came at her door. "Registered mail for Elena Sullivan," the postal worker announced, holding out an envelope and a clipboard. Elena signed for it with shaking hands, recognizing the return address. Whitmore, Patterson and Associates, a law firm she'd never heard of. Her first thought was that Marcus had moved quickly with the divorce papers, but when she opened the envelope, she found something entirely different. The letter was formal and businesslike, printed on heavy cream stationery. "Dear Mrs. Sullivan," it began, "it is our duty to inform you of the passing of your maternal uncle, Thomas Edward Whitmore, on October 15th. As his sole surviving blood relative, you have been named the primary beneficiary of his estate. Please contact our offices at your earliest convenience to discuss the details of your inheritance and the transfer of assets, which include but are not limited to real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and liquid assets." Elena read the letter 3 times, each time certain she must be misunderstanding. Uncle Thomas? She had vague memories of her mother mentioning a brother, but they'd been estranged long before Elena was born. She'd never met the man, never even seen a photograph. Why would he leave her anything, let alone what sounded like a substantial estate? With trembling fingers, she dialed the number on the letterhead. "Whitmore, Patterson and Associates," a professional voice answered. Elena explained who she was and why she was calling. Within minutes, she was connected to James Patterson himself, the senior partner. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said warmly, "we've been trying to locate you for weeks. Your uncle was a very successful real estate developer and investor. He never married, had no children, and specified in his will that everything should go to you, his only niece. I think you should come in as soon as possible. This inheritance is substantial." 2 days later, Elena sat in a leather chair in the law offices of Whitmore, Patterson and Associates, feeling completely out of place in her second-hand dress and worn shoes. James Patterson sat across from her, a thick will and several file folders spread before him. "Your Uncle Thomas was a remarkable man," he began. "Self-made, brilliant in business, but also quite private. He followed your life from a distance, never intruding but always aware." "I don't understand," Elena said quietly. "My mother never spoke of him except once or twice. She said they'd had a falling out when she was young. Why would he leave everything to me?" Patterson nodded sympathetically. "Your mother and Thomas had a disagreement when she chose to marry your father. Thomas thought she was making a mistake. Your father had a reputation as a gambler and a drifter. He was proven right, unfortunately, but by then, pride had built a wall between them. After your mother died, Thomas felt tremendous guilt that he'd never reconciled with her." Patterson opened the first folder. "He couldn't undo the past, but he could ensure your future. He tracked your life through private investigators, not invasively, just making sure you were all right. When you married Marcus Sullivan 2 years ago, he had concerns. His investigators discovered Marcus's pattern of failed businesses and mounting debts. Thomas worried you'd inherited your mother's tendency to choose poorly, but he hoped he was wrong." Elena felt a flush of shame, knowing that Thomas's concerns had been entirely justified. When Thomas learned he had terminal cancer 6 months ago, he updated his will one final time. Patterson continued. "Let me be direct about what you're inheriting, Mrs. Sullivan. Your uncle's estate is valued at approximately $47 million. The number hung in the air like something from a dream. Elena couldn't process it. That's not possible," she whispered. Patterson smiled. "I assure you it's very possible. It includes a portfolio of commercial properties in 3 states, diversified investments, and $12 million in liquid assets that will transfer to your accounts immediately upon completion of probate." Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, where 3 tiny lives were growing. In an instant, everything had changed. Her children wouldn't grow up in poverty. They'd have everything they needed: education, opportunities, security. She wouldn't have to work multiple jobs while pregnant with triplets. She could actually prepare properly for their arrival. But as relief flooded through her, she thought of Marcus, who had abandoned her because of their poverty, never knowing that wealth beyond imagination was just weeks away. "My husband," she said slowly. "Marcus doesn't know about any of this. He left me last month." James Patterson's expression remained professionally neutral, but Elena caught a flicker of something, satisfaction perhaps, in his eyes. "I see," he said carefully. "Has your divorce been finalized?" Elena shook her head. "He said his lawyer would send papers, but I haven't received anything yet. Honestly, I've been too overwhelmed to think about it." She paused, then added quietly, "There's something else he doesn't know. I'm pregnant. With triplets." Patterson leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers thoughtfully. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to be frank with you about the legal implications. Under state law, any assets you acquire during marriage are typically considered marital property, subject to division in a divorce. However, inheritances are generally considered separate property, belonging solely to the inheriting spouse, provided they're kept separate from marital assets and not commingled." He pulled out another folder. "Your uncle anticipated this possibility." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, confusion and hope warring within her. Patterson opened the folder, revealing several documents. Thomas included specific provisions in his will. He stipulated that if you were married at the time of his death, the inheritance would be structured as a trust with you as the sole beneficiary and trustee. The trust would be explicitly designated as your separate property, protected from any claims in a divorce proceeding. He also established educational trusts for any children you might have. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. Uncle Thomas, a man she'd never known, had protected her and her unborn children with remarkable foresight. "But what about child support?" she asked. "Marcus is their father, even if he left before knowing about them. Doesn't he have financial obligations?" Patterson nodded. "Absolutely. Your financial situation doesn't negate his parental responsibilities. However, you'll need to decide whether to inform him of the pregnancy and pursue support, or whether to exercise your rights independently." The question haunted Elena over the next few days as she moved through the process of claiming her inheritance. Marcus had abandoned her without a second thought, fleeing their struggles for what he perceived as a better opportunity. Part of her wanted him to know what he'd thrown away: the children, the fortune, the life they could have had. But a larger part of her recognized a truth she'd been avoiding. Marcus had shown her exactly who he was. He was a man who ran when things got difficult, who valued money and success over commitment and love. Did she really want such a man involved in raising her children? Within 2 weeks, Elena's life had transformed so completely it felt like a dream. The legal paperwork was finalized, and $12 million sat in her new bank account, a number so large it seemed almost meaningless. Patterson had connected her with a financial advisor who helped her understand the scope of her wealth and plan for her future. She'd given notice at both her jobs, moved out of the shabby apartment, and was now living in a hotel suite while searching for a permanent home. Shopping for maternity clothes in stores she'd previously only window shopped, Elena felt like a different person. But the face in the mirror was still hers, still the woman Marcus had found lacking, still the wife he'd abandoned without hesitation. The money hadn't changed who she fundamentally was. It had only changed her circumstances. She found herself thinking about him constantly, wondering where he was, whether he ever thought of her, whether he had any regrets. Her phone rang as she was examining cribs in an upscale baby boutique. The screen showed an unfamiliar Seattle number. For a wild moment, she wondered if it could be Marcus, but the voice that answered her hello was female and professional. "Is this Elena Sullivan?" the woman asked. "This is Jennifer Hartley from Eastside Realty. Your husband Marcus Sullivan listed you as his emergency contact, and I'm afraid there's been an incident." Elena's heart lurched despite everything. "What kind of incident? Is he all right?" There was a pause. "He's fine physically, but he's been arrested. There was an issue with the apartment he leased. Turns out he wrote bad checks. The landlord filed charges, and when the police investigated, they discovered several other creditors looking for him. He used your name and credit information on some applications. I'm calling because he's been asking for you to post bail." The audacity of it took Elena's breath away. Marcus had abandoned her, left her to struggle alone, and now that he was in trouble, he wanted her help. She thought of the man she'd loved, the man she'd believed would be her partner through anything. That man had never really existed. "I'm sorry," Elena said firmly, "but Marcus and I are separated. He left me. I'm not responsible for his debts or his decisions, and I won't be posting his bail. If he needs help, he'll have to find it elsewhere." After she hung up, Elena stood among the cribs and changing tables, her hand on her growing belly, and felt something shift inside her. She'd spent so much energy grieving what she'd lost, but Marcus had done her a favor by leaving. He'd shown her his true character before she'd wasted more years, before her children were old enough to be hurt by his abandonment. She didn't need him. Her babies didn't need a father who would run when things got tough. They needed her, strong, determined, and now able to provide them with every opportunity. Marcus Sullivan sat in the King County Jail, his mind racing. The Seattle job opportunity had been a disaster from the start. The position he'd been promised had evaporated when the company downsized, and he'd found himself scrambling for work in an expensive city where he knew no one. He'd written bad checks out of desperation, borrowed money he couldn't repay, and used Elena's information on applications because his own credit was destroyed. Now he was facing fraud charges and possible jail time. When Elena refused to help him, Marcus felt a mixture of anger and panic. How dare she abandon him in his time of need? Didn't their marriage vows mean anything? But as he sat in his cell, reality began to penetrate his self-righteous indignation. He'd walked out on Elena without looking back, had coldly informed her he was leaving and refused to listen to what she wanted to tell him. He'd been so sure he was escaping to something better, but he'd only escaped into a nightmare of his own making. His cellmate, a career criminal named Ray, listened to Marcus's bitter complaints with amusement. "So let me get this straight," Ray said. "You left your wife because you were poor, moved to a new city with no job lined up, started writing bad checks, and committed fraud using her identity. And now you're mad that she won't bail you out?" Hearing it summarized so bluntly made Marcus flinch. "You don't understand," he muttered. "We had nothing. I couldn't stand living like that anymore." "Yeah, well, how's jail working out for you?" Ray laughed. "Man, you're an idiot. You had a woman who stood by you through all your failures, and you threw her away. You're lucky she's just refusing to help instead of pressing charges for identity theft." Marcus lay on his bunk that night, unable to sleep, finally confronting some uncomfortable truths about himself. He'd always blamed external circumstances for his failures, bad luck, unfair breaks, other people's limitations. But maybe the common denominator in all his disasters was him. He called his court-appointed lawyer in the morning. "I need to know about my wife," he said. "We're separated, but we're still married. Can she be held responsible for any of this?" The lawyer reviewed his file. "Not for the criminal charges. Those are yours alone. But any debts incurred during the marriage could potentially be considered joint." "Why?" Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. "So, if we're still married, she might have to help pay what I owe?" The lawyer's expression turned disapproving. "Mr. Sullivan, I'd advise against that line of thinking. Focus on addressing your own situation." 2 months after Marcus's arrest, he was released on a plea deal that included restitution, probation, and community service. His Seattle life in ruins, he returned to his former city with nowhere to go and no resources. His first thought was Elena. They were still legally married. He'd never actually filed for divorce, too caught up in his own disasters. She'd have to take him back, at least temporarily. Surely she'd feel some obligation. He tracked her down through her old employer, only to discover she no longer worked there. In fact, both places she'd worked had told him she'd quit months ago without explanation. Confused and increasingly desperate, Marcus finally went to their old apartment building. The superintendent, a gruff man named Lou who'd never liked Marcus, greeted him with a cold stare. "She's gone," Lou said. "Moved outright after you left her high and dry. Paid up everything she owed and left no forwarding address." "Where did she go?" Marcus demanded. Lou shrugged. "No idea, and even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. That girl worked herself to the bone while you chased your fantasies. She deserves better than you showing up to ruin whatever life she's built. Marcus felt a flash of anger but also confusion. How had Elena afforded to pay off their debts and move? She'd been barely surviving when he left. Unless she'd found someone new. The thought filled him with unexpected jealousy. It took Marcus 3 more days of searching before he finally found her. He checked social media, called old friends, and eventually hired a cheap private investigator who tracked her down to an upscale address across town. Marcus stood outside the elegant townhouse, stunned. This couldn't be right. There must be some mistake. But when Elena emerged, dressed in expensive maternity clothes, her belly round and unmistakable with her advanced pregnancy, Marcus felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He approached her as she headed toward a luxury SUV parked in her driveway. "Elena," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. She froze, then turned slowly, her face carefully neutral. "Marcus," she said coolly. "What are you doing here?" Up close, he could see how much she'd changed. She looked healthy, glowing even, and there was a strength in her bearing that hadn't been there before. And she was very obviously pregnant. You're going to have a baby?" he stammered. Elena's hand moved protectively to her belly. "Babies," she corrected. "Triplets. I'm due in 6 weeks." Marcus's mind reeled with calculations. Elena was clearly 6 or 7 months pregnant, which meant, "They're mine," he said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "I'm the father. That's what you were trying to tell me the day I left, wasn't it?" Elena's expression remained impassive. "Yes," she said simply. "I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks before you abandoned me. I was waiting for your birthday to surprise you, but you didn't give me the chance." Marcus started, but she held up her hand, silencing him. "No," she said firmly. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to waltz back into my life now that it's convenient for you." Marcus looked around at the expensive townhouse, the luxury vehicle, her designer clothes. "How?" he asked. "How did you afford all this? When I left, we could barely make rent. Are you with someone else? Did you find some rich guy who took care of me the way you should have?" Elena finished coldly. "No, Marcus. I'm not with anyone. 2 weeks after you left me alone and pregnant, I inherited a fortune from an uncle I'd never met. Turns out my mother's estranged brother had been watching over me from a distance. When he died, he left me everything: properties, investments, money. Tens of millions of dollars, Marcus. I went from poverty to wealth overnight." The color drained from Marcus's face. You're rich," he whispered. Elena nodded. "Very. Rich enough that I'll never have to worry about money again. Rich enough to give our children every advantage, every opportunity. Rich enough to raise them on my own if I choose to." She paused, letting the full weight of what he'd thrown away sink in. "You left me because we were poor. You walked away from your marriage because you thought you'd find something better. And now here we are." Marcus felt sick. If he'd stayed, if he'd just held on a few more weeks, he would have been part of this incredible fortune. He'd be set for life, raising children with every advantage, living in luxury. Instead, he was a convicted fraudster on probation, homeless and broke, having destroyed every opportunity through his own selfishness and crime. "I made a mistake," he said desperately. "Elena, I was wrong. I was under so much pressure and I cracked. But I still love you. We're still married. Those are my children. Let me come home. Let me be a father to them." Elena studied him for a long moment, and Marcus saw genuine pity in her eyes, which somehow felt worse than anger would have. "You don't love me, Marcus," she said quietly. "You might have convinced yourself you do, but what you love is what I represent now: security, wealth, and escape from the consequences of your actions. You didn't love me when I was poor and struggling. You didn't love me enough to stay and face our problems together. You certainly didn't love me enough to listen when I tried to tell you about the pregnancy." Over the following weeks, Marcus made repeated attempts to insert himself back into Elena's life. He called constantly, showed up at her townhouse, left messages declaring his love and his right to be involved with his children. Elena, on the advice of her lawyer, documented everything but didn't engage. She was preparing for the birth of her triplets, creating a nursery, interviewing nannies, and building a support system that had nothing to do with the man who'd abandoned her. When Marcus finally received the divorce papers, they included a custody proposal that made his lawyer whistle. "She's not asking for child support," the lawyer explained. "She's offering you supervised visitation rights that can expand to partial custody after 1 year, provided you complete anger management courses, maintain steady employment, and stay out of legal trouble. She's also requiring paternity tests, which is standard. But here's the interesting part. She's offering you a trust fund." Marcus looked up sharply. "What kind of trust fund?" The lawyer read from the document. "She's establishing educational trusts for each child valued at $1 million each. Additionally, she's offering to place $2 million in a trust for you with very specific conditions. You can access it for education, job training, mental health counseling, or to start a legitimate business. But you can't touch it for personal expenses, and if you violate your probation or engage in any illegal activity, the trust reverts entirely to the children." It was more generosity than Marcus had any right to expect, and he knew it. Elena was essentially offering him a path to rebuild his life and be a father to his children, but on terms that protected everyone involved. She'd been poor, desperate, and alone when he left her, but she'd survived and emerged stronger. Now she held all the power, and she was choosing to be merciful rather than vindictive. The triplets, 2 boys and a girl, were born on a bright June morning. Elena had arranged for a birth team that included a doula, specialized nurses, and her closest friend from a support group for mothers of multiples. Marcus, having signed the divorce agreement and custody arrangement, was allowed to visit the hospital after the babies were stabilized. He stood at the nursery window, staring at his 3 children, and felt the full weight of what his choices had cost him. Elena found him there hours later. She looked exhausted but radiant, already showing the fierce protectiveness of a mother determined to give her children the world. "They're beautiful," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry, Elena. For everything. I know sorry doesn't fix what I did, but I need you to know I truly am." Elena nodded slowly. "I believe you," she said. "But apologies aren't enough. These children deserve a father who shows up, who does the work, who stays even when things are difficult. Can you be that person?" Marcus looked at his children, his daughter, whom Elena had named Hope, and his sons, whom she'd named Marcus Jr. and Thomas, after his father and her uncle. "I want to be," he said honestly. "I don't know if I can, but I want to try." Elena studied him for a long moment. "Then start by honoring the agreement. Get your life together. Prove through actions, not words, that you can be trusted. Maybe someday you'll have a real relationship with your children. But that's something you'll have to earn." As Marcus left the hospital that night, he understood that some mistakes can't be undone, only learned from. He'd thrown away a woman who loved him, a fortune that could have been his, and the chance to be a full-time father to his children from the start. Elena had offered him a path forward, but she'd also shown him that she didn't need him. She'd become someone who could build a life on her own terms, who could raise 3 children with strength and grace, who could be generous to the man who'd hurt her without ever being weak. Elena watched the sunrise through her hospital window, her 3 babies sleeping in their bassinets beside her bed. She thought of the woman she'd been when Marcus left, scared, alone, ashamed of her poverty. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who discovered that true strength came not from money or marriage, but from making the choice, again and again, to keep going. She'd survived abandonment and emerged wealthy, yes, but more importantly, she'd emerged whole. Her children would know a mother who taught them that love meant staying, that commitment meant keeping your word, that wealth was nothing compared to integrity. The future stretched before her, bright, uncertain, full of possibility. She had resources to give her children every advantage, but more importantly, she had herself, tested and proven. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same determination that had carried her through. And if Marcus could become the father his children deserved, she would welcome his involvement. But if he couldn't, well, She'd already proven she could do this alone. She'd been poor and powerless when he left her. Now she was rich and strong. And she'd never forget the woman who'd survived the transformation or let anyone make her feel small again.